Alright, son. Good night.
Daddy?
Yes?
Daddy? I can't sleep without a bedtime story.
Well, what bedtime story do you want me to tell you?
A new one!
Okay. Once upon a time...
Once upon a time, in a land far too close, a man named Nixon made a huge mistake. It was called Watergate.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
But this isn't about Watergate. This is the story of the man who took Nixon's place, our 38th president, Gerald R. Ford. Ford came into the world on July 14th, 1913, in Omaha, Nebraska. Back then, he was named Leslie Lynch Jr. After his parents separated, he moved with his mom to Grand Rapids, Michigan. His mom met and fell in love with his future stepfather, Gerald R. Ford. From then on, little Leslie took his father's name and excelled at football. He actually had offers to join the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. Instead, he went to the University of Michigan and received a degree in economics. There, he continued playing football and was awarded the MVP of the team. He later on went to graduate school at Yale to study law.
But a crisis soon changed everything. America finally entered World War II, and Ford joined the Navy to support the war effort. Ford became an operations officer on the aircraft carrier the USS Monterey. When the war ended, he resumed his law practice. Fortunately, he met his future wife, Elizabeth Bloomer Warren, and subsequently married her the following year in 1948. Their marriage happened right before he won a seat in Congress. There, he stayed for a long time. He worked as a House Minority Leader from 1965 to 1973. But despite his best efforts, he was never made the official Speaker of the House. On October 10, 1973, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after accusations of income tax evasions and bribery. Nixon thus nominated Ford to take his place.
Ford was approved and granted the vice presidential spot almost right before the president himself was ensconced in a scandal.
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
On August 8th, 1974, Nixon resigned, and who took his place?
Ford!
Yes, Brady, Ford took his place, but in a highly controversial move, Ford pardoned.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Many assumed that the former president had struck a deal with Ford. On the contrary, Ford always claimed that he did the right thing for the good of the country. He chose former governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, to take his place as vice president. As president, he faced many troubles and trials, such as bad press, from both his decision to pardon Nixon and Saturday Night Live's parody of his trips, inflation, and a downright bad economy.
Raindrops kept falling on their heads as Gerald and Betty Ford arrived in Austria. And President Ford kept falling on his head, first in Salzburg in front of Austrian Chancellor Kreisky. All right, thanks for dropping by. Then in Michigan on a trip up the same stairs.
In addressing these problems and his ideas for national reform, he faced an opposed Congress known as the Watergate class. The majority of the people in Congress were Democrats. Needless to say, Congress did not cooperate with Ford very well, so Ford was limited to using his veto to exercise his power. One huge part of his domestic policy was fighting inflation, whom he named public enemy number one. During that time, the nation was facing a crisis of stagflation, or an economy with both high inflation and high unemployment. However, Ford decided to focus completely on inflation. He created a program known as WIN, or Whip Inflation Now, in 1974. The program, although it had a lot of publicity, didn't last due to its lack of effectiveness and soon was phased out by the end of the year. Unemployment, however, skyrocketed during this time. Meanwhile, New York City almost went bankrupt. But perhaps the most interesting part of his legacy as president was that he was almost assassinated not once, but twice, and both by women. Lynette Squeaky Frome and Sarah Jane Moore both tried to assassinate him and failed.
The White House press office has now identified the woman as Lynn Ellis Fromm, 26 years old, of Sacramento, and they say that she is linked with the Charles Manson family.
On September 22nd, in another California town, San Francisco, another radical, another gun, the same president. Sarah Jane Moore's motives were confused. Her purpose was not.
I knew that that's the only shot I would have was a headshot. He came out, looked right at me, and after I fired the shot, he stopped.
In terms of foreign policy, much can be said. He gave aid to both Israel and Egypt and helped them make peace with each other. In November of 1974, Ford became the first American president to go to Japan while in office. There, he made a speech encouraging closer Japanese-American relations. In 1975, South Vietnam fell to communism.
Several weeks later, the Mayaguez incident occurred. The 39-man crew of the SS Mayaguez was captured off the coast of Cambodia in the Gulf of Siam. The Gulf of Siam was supposed to be for international use, but Khmer Rouge, the communist dictator of Cambodia at the time, claimed it belonged only to Cambodia. Ford mishandled the situation. When negotiations didn't work, he attempted to save the crew by getting the military to intervene. According to all possible news brought during that time, he assumed that the Mayaguez was docked at Koh Tang. Thus, he sent 16 helicopters and a frigate for support. Unfortunately, he did not realize how heavily armed Koh Tang was. Even then, once they reached Koh Tang, they spent hours fruitlessly searching for the crew before realizing that the crew had been taken to the mainland. Although we were eventually able to recover the crew, more people died in the process of trying to save them than the actual number of crew members recovered. Ford lost to Carter in the election of 1976. After his presidency, he published his memoir, A Time to Heal. Years later, he made a cameo on the ABC show Dynasty, along with a former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. In the end, he dies. He dies?
He died at 93. Let's be happy. He lived a long and full life, although he was a failure as a president.
I can't sleep now. First, Nixon has to die. Now Gerald is dead. I'm gonna have nightmares. Do any presidents not die?
Everyone dies, Brady. But this one hasn't. Not yet.
Carter came into the world on October 1st, 1924, in a hospital in Plains, Georgia. He was the first president to be born in a hospital. He was born to a strictly Baptist family. He grew up in the town of Archery with his peanut farmer dad, James Earl Carter Sr., and his registered nurse mom, Lillian Carter. His mom would give free advice to African American women about their health, setting a precedent of equality for his son. Carter would help his dad on the farm, often stacking the crops and taking and selling them in town for a profit. Once, at the young age of 13, he bought 3 houses using the money he earned and rented those houses out to people. It was during the Great Depression, so he got the houses for pretty cheap.
Carter began to become more and more involved in his community, but he also made a statement by becoming the only white male in his town to refuse membership of the White Citizens Council. He ran again in 1971 and won a seat as governor. He ran as a Democrat in the 1976 presidential election, presenting himself as a change from the self-interested politics and scandal of Washington in recent years. He was elected president on November 2, 1976. His efforts to lower inflation and high interest rates at home created a short recession instead of aiding the economy.
As for foreign policy, in 1978, Carter oversaw a new agreement known as the Camp David Agreement, which called for peace between Israel and Egypt. Perhaps one of his best accomplishments in foreign affairs, he effectively diffused the tension and resolved the crisis. He also started opening diplomatic relations with China and completed the SALT II treaty with Russia. This treaty was highly controversial and was ineffective in slowing down the nuclear arms race. Another crisis also occurred during his presidency. The American embassy staff of Iran was seized and held hostage against their will for 14 months.
This is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché. he was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm
His
him.
ineffective handling of the situation cost him the election of 1980. He became a professor at Emory University in 1982. He volunteers with his wife for Habitat for Humanity. In 2002, he even won the Nobel Peace Prize. And you know what the best part about Carter is? He most certainly is still alive and living with his wife in the plains today.
The end. Well, I hope you... Good night, Brady.